Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome on behalf of the previous speakers and the next speakers. Thank you for being here. While we don't have to struggle this any further, it started working. I'm going to talk about a subject which is known as revisioning of mythology. I'll explain what that is. But for a moment, let's all imagine that this is not just a small room, this is the court of the Kaurava princess. I know it's kind of small, but let your imagination run a little wild. This is a court where the dice game has kind of just happened. Yudhishthir has lost everything. He staked his wife, he lost her too. They're all sitting in one corner, heads hung. On the orders of Duryodhan, Draupadi is being brought here. Draupadi, in a state of absolute dishevel, disoriented, trying to hold on to the last shred of her trailing clothes, is here. She pleads, inability to kind of help herself. She apologizes for her attire, and she folds her hands and kind of greets the elders. After this, she asks one of the most important questions of Mahabharata, which none could answer at that stage. And the question was, what right did Yudhishthir have to stake Draupadi after he had staked himself and lost? I repeat, what right did Yudhishthir have to stake Draupadi after he had staked himself and lost? As I mentioned, this is one of the most pertinent questions asked, and none could answer that question at that point of time. Bhishma did try and mumble something which didn't quite amount to anything. My worry is not this. My worry is I personally feel this was still not the right question. The right question ought to have been, what right did Yudhishthir have to stake her at all? That's the question that should have been asked. The question is, why was this question not asked? Draupadi is kind of seen as one of the first feminists of Indian mythology. She was strong, she was opinionated, she could stand her ground in a group of men. She was a strong woman, she was fireborn, she was the Yagna Seni. Then why did she not ask this question? This is what we refer to as what we call internalization of patriarchy. The internalization of patriarchy is so strong that unfortunately women themselves could probably not ask the right question. Mythology has been a forum or a subject for the men, by the men, where women generally did not have any significant role to play. They have either been an appendage, they've just been there. They didn't really have a strong role to play, and probably one of the reasons that we find is that these were stories narrated by the men. And that is why probably we didn't have any significant role for the women. Any other case, for example, if we look at the other stories, this internalization of women has been so strong that none of the women have ever questioned this kind of a storytelling. And that is the major issue that we find in all of them. There is a school of thought in the study of mythology which is known as the functionalist school of thought, which kind of explains that every myth has a function. Every myth has to have a reason. Yes, all the myths that we have, they weren't just the stories of somebody just narrating some tales. They had a purpose. Unfortunately, the major purpose had always been patriarchy, setting down social norms and behavioral norms. And that is why the whole story of Eve's quest for knowledge has been touted as Eve's submission to temptation. And thus she was punished by elimination or ouster from the Garden of Eden, and look where you and I are today. Had she only not questioned, had she only not been so curious, we'd all be in the heavens. all the problems that we have today is again blamed to Pandora, who opened the box, and all the kind of problems we have today. Claude Lévi-Strauss, a French anthropologist, has said, "I therefore claim to show not how men think in myths, but how myths operate in men's mind without their being even aware of it." And this is exactly how myths play in the mind of us. Revisioning is the need of the hour. Adrian Rich has defined revisioning as the act of looking back, of seeing with fresh eyes. It's important for us to reinterpret or read between the lines the myths afresh. It is important that we take this standard reading of myths away from the usual one and shift it to a what I call male androcentric gaze. We'll have to move it from a typical male perspective of the story. And in this particular case, I would like to bring out a very important shloka. This is known as the Panchkanya Shlok. The Panchkanya Shlok refers to the Shlok of the 5 virgins. The Panchkanya Shlok goes like this: Ahalya Draupadi Kunti Tara Mandodari Tatha Panchkanya Smare Nitya Mahapatak Nashak. These are the 5 women. They are touted as 5 virgins. And if you utter Smare Nityam, if you utter this shloka every day, literally chant it every day in the morning, Mahapatak Nashak, you will be safe from any kind of a transgression. Now, this particular shlok is a bit of a paradox. It's a paradox because none of the 5 women that we are seeing here were quite the faithful and the goody-goody wives that patriarchy has suggested. For that matter, they were not even virgins. In that case, why is this being touted as something that will forbid human beings from a transgression? That is the important question here. And there is an anthropologist, Kendall Burridge, who has said that myths are stories stamped large with social approval. The longer they stay contained in myths, the truth, the longer it will persist, to mold the thoughts of the community in the way of its implications. And that's the important point here. The thoughts, the shloka being in its place, the thoughts have been remained, or what has been fed has been staying in our minds for a bit too long. Let's look at the shlok once again. And let's take 3 characters. Ahalya. Ahalya, the wife of a sage, made love with Lord Indra, knowing fully well that this was not her husband, who was supposed to be in a disguise. Draupadi. Draupadi had 5 husbands. Kunti had a premarital child from Lord Surya, and she didn't mention this to her husband ever. The question here is, and just for record, Tara and Mandodari are supposed to have married their brother-in-laws after the death of their husbands. Tara, wife of Vali, and Mandodari, wife of Ravan. The question here is, why do we have to really utter this? What we are missing out here is that probably the scholars of the times, the people who wrote this, were probably telling people that the chastity, the notion of chastity and virginity was way different, and occasional aberration is acceptable. What has happened over a period of time is that what has been drilled in our heads is way different, and what has been uttered here is simply a kind of an injunction which we have internalized without quite getting the meaning of it. And that is why we find that such shlokas are there, but unfortunately we are just uttering them in terms of just a ritual uttering, as I would call it. We have also seen in a number of cases that women have always played a very subservient role in mythology. In mythology, what has happened is that men have played all the role and women are just about in a very passive role here. I'll take a simple example here. All of us say that, oh, women had great positions in the earlier times. They had swayamvars. Swayamvar, selecting your own husband. Let me take 2 best or the most important swayamvars of Indian mythology. That of Sita and Draupadi. Swayamvar in these 2 particular cases is such a misnomer. The 2 of them there was a contest of strength and skill. There was a contest of strength and skill wherein whoever achieved the target could get married. They would get a trophy. In this particular case, it was Sita and Draupadi who were the trophy. There was no selection. The one who hit the target or the narrator decided who the two of them would get married to. Both Sita and Draupadi did not have a choice. So once again we see that the perspective is that Swayamvar is all about selecting your own husband, but in this particular case they did not have a choice. At least Draupadi, till quite some time she did not know about it, she did not have a choice. What if Ram had not won that Swayamvar and somebody else had? So it all depends on the narrator. So we use the word Swayamvar, but that's not the case. Sorry. Now, that's why it is important to understand that the need of the hour is to revision mythology. Revision mythology, I propose that it should be revisioned from the perspective of the women here. The perspective of the women, because we are probably missing a number of things here. There could be many of the myths, there could be many of the stories which has not been understood. It's time to read between the lines. It's time to identify the particular women that we are talking about and give them a voice. There is a possibility that some of the voice have been stifled. There has been a possibility that some of them did not get a chance to speak. It's time to give that voice a chance. It's time to give that silent voice a voice. It's now time to look at certain stories in a different way. All of us have heard Shakuntala's story as written by Sage Kalidas as one of those lovely romantic stories wherein the poor girl was left in the lurch, she gets married and left in the lurch by King Dushyant, who unfortunately, due to the curse of an irascible sage like Sage Durvasa, suffered from temporary amnesia. That's not the story. The original story is told in Mahabharata, and that's the story we need to pull out of the rug. The original story is way different as told by Sage Vyas. We need to read that story. According to that story, Shakuntala was an extremely independent, smart, intelligent, fairy woman. She could hold her own ground. She could absolutely, with her insecurities, she was comfortable with it. And at one stage, she actually walks in to the court of King Dushyant, reprimands him, exposes his philandering ways, and forces him to accept her and her child as the heir apparent. That's the story that needs to be told. It's time when Draupadi starts asking the right question. Draupadi should be given the voice to ask the question why she was forced to marry 5 people when she was in love with only one person, and that is Arjun. That's the question that should be asked, and it's now time. It's also time for us to understand that we need to change the ideas of the kind of stories that we've been telling people. All of us are aware of the great story of Savitri and her quest for her husband's life, right? Everybody knows what all she did and what extent she goes to save the life of her husband. Yes, this has been told right from the child time. The girls are this much. We are drilling into them this kind of a story to say, do whatever it has to save your husband. I don't have a problem with the story as such. It's a lovely story. Please say it. It's part of the epics. Please say it. But I would insist we tell this story when you have a similar story of a man going to that extent to save his wife. If you don't have a story like that, don't tell the story to young girls. That's what I'm trying to say. It is now time to change the narrative. It is now time to change the format. Everybody knows about Parshuram. Parshuram, the person who is supposed to have beheaded his mother. Beheaded his mother for what reason? Because the father said, behead your mother. For what reason? Because of a momentary lapse of chastity. Momentary. I would rather use the word a fleeting lapse of chastity. And for that, the father is supposed to have ordered that the mother be beheaded. It's time to say it was really not that big a crime. It was just a fleeting, momentary fraction of a second where the woman saw a Gandharva or a celestial being and kind of felt enamored. But as I said, fraction of a second. Is the story a story which needs to be told from the perspective of the fact that it was a lapse of chastity? It's time to retell or relook or not even tell certain stories if need be. Carl Jung is supposed to have said that myths are born out of the collective unconsciousness of a society. And they are made up of what he calls as archetypes. Archetypes are recurring symbols of a collective representation. For example, if I say a stepmother, you immediately have an idea of what the character is going to be. So a stepmother, a hero, a villain, whatever. These are what create our myths. And it is very, very important that these kind of collective stories are brought up from that kind of a mindset. Adrian Rich has said, we need to know the writing of the past and know it differently than we have ever known it. Remember, as I mentioned, she's the champion when it comes to revisioning of myths. Not to pass on a tradition, but to break its hold over us. Break its hold over us. However, let me make one thing very clear is that revisioning as such is not a new subject. In our country, revisioning has been happening way back. Way back in the 3rd or 4th century, Bhasa, the Sanskrit poet, is supposed to have written plays from a very different perspective. For example, he wrote Urubhanga, a Sanskrit play in which Duryodhan was the hero. When we all know Duryodhan was the arch villain in Mahabharata, right? In 16th century in Bengal, Chandrabati is supposed to have written a Ramayana from Sita's perspective, right? In modern times, we have Volga, who's written from the perspective of the wronged women of Ramayana, like Ahalya and Surpanakha. So to that extent, it's not a new subject, but I only personally feel that it's now kind of critical, it's now kind of very important that we need to revision this mythology, and things are not too late. And once again, let me just define that archetypes are something that we have in our mind. I personally feel that it's now time to create new archetypes. We need to create new archetypes and leave them in the collective unconscious of the present society, of the present generation, so that after a couple of 100 years, we've only done good to the world and not bad. Thank you.